Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us today, and welcome to the February edition of the Sustainable Forest Education Cooperative webinar series. My name is Peter Deezer. I'm the Extension Educator for Forest-Dependent Wildlife. I'm sitting in for Lane Mosier today. Just a couple quick things to share. I've placed a few items into the chat. If you'd like continuing ed credits, you can click on the link I provided to submit a request there. Also, I shared links to the 2026 SFEC webinar series calendar and our event calendar. We'd love to have you join us for future webinars and events that we have planned in 2026. If for some reason you don't see those, maybe you hopped in a couple, minutes into after I started, I'll post them again and near the end, and you'll have a second opportunity to see them. Um, I'm excited today to be joined by Spencer Rettler. Spencer is a non-game wildlife specialist with the Minnesota DNR Division of Ecological and Water Resources. Today, Spencer will discuss vernal pools, which provide critical habitat for a suite of forest-dependent wildlife species in Minnesota. Spencer will share why these seasonal wetlands are so critically important, the types of wildlife species that rely on them, and how to conserve the integrity of these sensitive features when conducting forest management activities. Please share your questions in the chat, and we'll try to get to them at the end of Spencer's presentation. Welcome, Spencer. It's great to have you with us today.
Great. Thank you, Peter. And thank you, everyone, for attending here today. It's really exciting to see so many people interested in vernal pools. So I'm a non-game wildlife specialist with the non-game wildlife program at the Minnesota DNR. And specifically, we focus on species that are not hunted or not harvested. And really, our main goal is to maintain and protect Minnesota's native biodiversity. And a large part of what we focus on is rare species and very biodiverse hotspots. And in the areas that I work, which is kind of north central to northeastern Minnesota, vernal pools are a habitat that is considered to be extremely biodiverse and is often found kind of within this landscape. And essentially, these are forested wetlands. We'll get into a little bit more about definitions as we go. But just essentially, this picture kind of here demonstrates what a typical vernal pool might look like. And today I want to talk about why these are important, why you should care and want to protect them, and talk about strategies to protect them. And I should just give you a bit of a disclaimer too. I'm getting over COVID right now, so I have a little bit of lingering congestion and a cough, and likely some brain fog as well. So if I start talking gibberish, you know why. So to give you a bit of a roadmap of what we're going to discuss today, first we're going to just try to define, what is a vernal pool? Where might you find them? We then want to talk about why are they important and why you should care. Next, we'll talk about strategies to try to protect them, different methods that you can utilize, particularly focused on forest management. And then I also want to talk a little bit about what the DNR is specifically doing to study or to learn about these types of habitats. So first and foremost, what is a vernal pool? And here we have this aerial shot from above of a vernal pool in the spring. This is leaf-off conditions. And you might be looking at this and go, yeah, I know what you're talking about. I know what a vernal pool is. I've seen these, but perhaps you've heard of them by a different name. And in fact, vernal pools go by a plethora of different names. This is to a degree a kind of a debated topic within the realm of people studying this type of habitat. So essentially, I want to point out the fact that all of these names, all of these terms for vernal pools are acceptable. People have strong opinions on why they pick a certain name over another. I think it's just important that you just recognize that while this is going by one name in this talk as a vernal pool, all of these are roughly explaining the same type of habitat. And what's really fun about this name is you can kind of mix and match pool, pond, wetland with any of these names. So you could have a vernal wetland or a vernal pond or a vernal pool. So it just complicates the situation even further. But just know that not only are these diverse habitats, but they have a diversity of names as well. But something that is roughly agreed upon within the realm of vernal pools and how to define them are some key characteristics. First and foremost, these are hydrologically isolated basins or depressions. And for today's talk, we're going to focus on those that occur within a forested landscape. In theory, you can have a vernal pool or ephemeral wetland or seasonal pond in a grassland. But today we're just focusing on these forested ones. So again, these hydrologically isolated basins, just essentially meaning that there is no permanent water source contributing to these wetlands. In some extreme years, maybe in a high water year, there might be some overflow from a permanent wetland or an open water body that contributes to this, but in general, they are hydrologically isolated. They're typically relatively small within size. I would say a half an acre vernal pool is massive. I would say the majority of them are a quarter of an acre or smaller, and they are generally relatively shallow, about a meter deep or so. So I'm talking anywhere from knee to waist deep. Maybe in some extreme cases, you're looking at something that's about chest deep at its deepest point. But in general, the majority of these are quite shallow. They're also characterized by hydric soils. These are essentially soils that are often in an anaerobic environment, meaning that they don't have a lot of readily available oxygen. They're just often underwater, they're saturated. And a lot of the plants that grow in these hydric soils are kind of indicative of that characteristic. So oftentimes you might see plants that you would only see in a wetland growing within these areas, even if water is not present. And kind of, I got ahead of myself a little bit there, and this fact of water not being present, a very, very key characteristic of these wetlands is they experience temporarily flooding, or these periods of flooding and drying. When I say drying, I mean they fully dry out at times of the year. And this alternating period of flooding and drying doesn't necessarily need to occur in a single growing season. You can have a vernal pool that might be inundated with water for a couple years and then eventually dries out and refills again, or vice versa, where it is bone dry for a couple years and then fills up. And we've even kind of seen that second case these last couple years, where we're having really mild springs with minimal snowpack and kind of drought conditions in the spring, that a lot of these vernal pools are, if not a little bit of water, just completely bone dry throughout some of the spring, yet they are still technically a vernal pool. And as part of that temporarily flooding and drying, these wetlands cannot support fish populations. And for a lot of the animals that utilize these vernal pools, that is really, really a key component to their survival. And I really want to stress this point that these are extremely dynamic systems. I often like to view them as something that's called a resource pulse. So another example of a resource pulse might be a whale carcass. And that sounds really morbid, but think about a whale carcass that washes up on a beach or it sinks to the ocean floor. For a short period of time, that is a very resource-rich opportunity for a lot of scavengers, a lot of different plants and animals. So, as that gets scavenged, everyone is benefiting from those nutrients. As that decomposes, those nutrients return to the soil and promote plant life. And so, in the sense of a vernal pool, like that water is that life-giving resource. A lot of different animals really hone in and utilize that water when it is present, but it is not always available to them. So it's this kind of hyper-focused resource that only is available for a short period of time, or this pulse resource. And so here I have a kind of a series of photos just showing you visually how dynamic these systems are. And so it's going to be the same wetland taken from roughly the same perspective throughout a single growing season. So here we have about mid-April, you can see leaf out has not yet occurred. We have some vegetative growth within the margins of this wetland, but for the most part, it's just kind of an open basin or open pool. And now by mid-May, you get a lot of vegetative growth showing up within the vernal pool, as well as the forest and surrounding areas starting to leaf out, and a lot of organic debris falling into that wetland as well. Here we have about mid-July. You can see that really the forest all around is in full swing. A lot of vegetation is growing into the interior of this wetland. And if you look closely, you can see that there's still a little bit of standing water in the interior of this wetland. But again, by mid-July, things have dropped down pretty significantly. And here we have slightly different perspective, but again, same vernal pool that, if you didn't have necessarily a keen eye or knew what you were looking for, you might not know that this was inundated with water earlier in the year. Looking at this, you see that there is very little woody debris, or there's very little woody shrubs or trees growing in the interior. not a whole lot of vegetation, just a lot of leaf litter. So that might kind of cue you in that there's something happening here. And in many cases, these are signs of vernal pools. Here's just kind of a fun time lapse. So I'll get into it hopefully at the end here about some of the monitoring efforts we're doing. But here is one of the vernal pools that we monitor. This is one of our deeper vernal pools. In the middle there, you might see that white post there. It's just kind of it's a bit of an index for us just to kind of like try to gauge the water level, but you can't really see the numbers on this particular post. But here's just a time lapse of the entire growing season of one of the vernal pools. You can kind of see when those water levels start to drop. And if you got a really keen eye, you might see that there are some people moving through in random quick frames as we're doing some different monitoring efforts. And as well as in the fall, you'll see a particular species or particular wildlife that I wouldn't necessarily first associate with vernal pools, but we actually often see on these trail cameras. So you can see kind of in the reflection of the water as that leaf out occurs, getting into June here. Not a lot of change in water levels, but it's here about in mid-July that you start to see water levels slowly start to drop down. As I mentioned, this is one of those deeper vernal pools, so this held water pretty late into the year. And if you're seeing there's one critter that's passing through a lot in this vernal pool, and that is a black bear. And so, picking up here in the end of or middle of October, but generally this wetland held water till about mid to late September. A lot of the wetlands we monitor are holding water till mid-July, early August or so. So again, this is kind of one of the more extremes. And so far, I've really only shown you kind of these open basins or pools that are kind of maybe the picture perfect vernal pool, this little woodland pool. But in reality, they come in a lot of different shapes and sizes. So to kind of give you a bit of an idea, generally they just have a lot of structural complexity. In this one, there's a lot of down woody debris. This is just kind of one long trough. And you got vegetation growing in the margins. You got some vegetation growing in the interior. But it's just not that obvious connected pool that you saw in some of the previous photos. Here's another case where we have a little bit more open canopy and a little bit shallower water, which really promotes a lot of this graminoid growth or a lot of these sedges that grow in. So throughout this whole thing, there is still standing water, but you are also having a lot of this graminoid growth kind of growing all throughout this vernal pool, as well as some tree and shrub growth in the interior. Here we have another example of kind of the diversity that we see. These are kind of really hummocky wetlands where we have trees and shrubs. So we have a lot of black ash and yellow birch and red maple growing in the interior, as well as some speckled alder. And they're growing on these hummocks or these little islands in the interior of these vernal pools. And yet these are still kind of that same category or same umbrella of a vernal pool. Again, just kind of another example of maybe one of those larger basins, but even within that basin, you can see the deeper open water, as well as kind of more in the front of the photo here, those shallower sedgy waters. So even within a single vernal pool, you can kind of almost have two different categories or types. This is an example of what I would maybe consider more of like a flashy vernal pool. So this is about midsummer, I guess probably about more in mid to late June, that this is already dried up. You can see some evidence that this was inundated. You can see kind of in the front part of the photo, kind of that decaying wet leaf litter. And then just a little bit farther back into the woods, you see that drier, kind of crispier leaf litter. So you can kind of see that this area has been underwater. I mean, there's some species that kind of really focus on these types of more flashy vernal pools, whereas others require vernal pools that hold water later into the year. And just kind of another example of that kind of diversity, that structural complexity that we see within various types of vernal pools. And this is just wanting to point out that it really, really helps locate vernal pools if you're looking for these during a leaf-off condition, specifically in the spring. This is an image where I am standing right next to the vernal pool, taking a photo straight into it, and you can't really even tell that it's there because of how dense that vegetative growth is. So if you're trying to look for these on your landscapes, I highly recommend going out leaf-off conditions, and more often than not, trying to go out in the spring. And so where do kind of the highest densities or concentrations of vernal pools occur within Minnesota? So many of you might be familiar with ecological classification systems. So within the DNR, we have different ways of breaking apart Minnesota into different provinces, sections, and subsections. Um, these are often based on land type associations or land type characteristics. And in these maps here, that kind of blue patterning, that is, with a bit of a disclaimer, I would say that is just a rough representation or a rough index of where vernal pools might occur. This is actually using what's called National Wetland Inventory data, and we just subset it based on specific categories that might fit a vernal pool. So it had to be, a certain size, so a relatively small wetland. It had to be found within upland forest. And so it's just some criteria in which we kind of filtered this out. But for those familiar with National Wetland Inventory data, they know that there's a lot of stuff that is missed, that a lot of boundaries are not necessarily accurate. So again, just use this as a rough index. So within the ecological provinces, we see that the vast majority of vernal pools exist within the Laurentian mixed forest, with some kind of in that northwestern part of the eastern broadleaf forest. But when you start to break things down into sections, we see that in the majority of these vernal pools fall within the northern Minnesota drift and lakes plains, as well as the western superior uplands. And this is roughly where I do the majority of my work. And then you also see a kind of scattering of vernal pools in that northern superior uplands area as well. So far, we've kind of talked about, what defines a vernal pool, where might you find them, and kind of the variation that you see within that vernal pool category. Next, I want to talk about, why are these important? Why should you care? So first and foremost, these are extremely biologically diverse. And when it comes to, what species or what taxa is the most diverse, I would argue that it is our aquatic invertebrates. It is pretty impressive that if you spend just a couple minutes looking at a vernal pool, how many different species you see moving around. So this is a variety of different insects, as well as even mollusks, so mussels, clams, and even crustaceans. And I think kind of a poster child of vernal pools, at least in my mind, is something called the fairy shrimp. And so here's a little video of, if you can see it, kind of cruising along there. I know this is not the greatest focus, but that is a fairy shrimp. It is a type of crustacean. And in Minnesota, at least, it is endemic to vernal pools. Like, they do not occur anywhere else. You can see kind of how slow moving it is. That'd be a really, really easy treat for any kind of fish species. So again, these fishless habitats are extremely important to them. And they have a really, really short life cycle. It's approximately 3 weeks or so, in which, as soon as that vernal pool ices out in the spring, they emerge from a dormant cyst, they develop, reproduce, and die away kind of within that 3-week window. And they deposit these cysts then in the vernal pool that can survive multiple years of dry conditions. So even if that vernal pool doesn't fill up the following year, these will still exist and can emerge once that vernal pool does eventually fill up. In addition to kind of these unique crustaceans, there's a lot of different caddisflies, water beetles, the larval stages of a lot of different damselflies and dragonflies develop in these habitats, as well as water bugs, midges, and yes, I will admit, our other state bird, the mosquito, the larval development does occur. If you look in this image, you see a lot of kind of those like twitching, kind of blackish larvae. Those are mosquito larvae. But really, really a diverse, unique assemblage of a lot of different aquatic invertebrates. And as I mentioned, mollusks, that's something that, at least when I first started learning about vernal pools, I would not associate a vernal pool with a place that has mussels or clams. But here we have a fingernail clam that is often found within vernal pools. And I'll admit I'm no expert on these, but what I really see is situations where vernal pools are either they absolutely do not have any fingernail clams, or some that are just absolutely covered in them. So I don't really know what the driving mechanism there is, but these are a relatively common mussel found within vernal pools. Excuse me, I'll take a drink of tea quick. And it's not just animals that are extremely diverse within these habitats. There's a lot of really unique plants that are associated with vernal pools, or kind of the margins of vernal pools. And one of those is the state-threatened narrow triangle moonwort. This is a type of fern species. And these are often kind of found more in those flashier vernal pool habitats that I kind of referred to earlier, that they may not hold water into August or September. These are ones that are going to dry up more so in June or so. But these are kind of associated more so with kind of those flashy sites, as well as kind of the margins of maybe some larger vernal pools. But again, this is a state threatened fern species that is often associated with these habitats. And I would be remiss if I didn't talk about something near and dear to my heart, which is a lot of the different amphibians that utilize these habitats. So there's a lot of different frog species that really depend on these habitats for reproduction. So you have stuff like wood frog is a great example of an obligate vernal pool species, as well as stuff like spring peepers, boreal chorus frogs will utilize these for reproduction and their larval development, as well as a lot of our different salamander species here in Minnesota. So blue spotted salamanders, sometimes even eastern newts or tiger salamanders might use these habitats, as well as what we have here, which is the four-toed salamander. Near the end of this talk here, I'll hopefully talk a little bit about some of the work we're doing with four-toed salamanders, but this is a rare salamander species. And I just want to touch on kind of some unique aspects of their breeding ecology in relation to vernal pools. So for something like a spotted salamander or blue spotted salamander, they generally deposit their eggs within the wetland and leave them there to develop. Whereas the four-toed salamander, kind of the females go through this unique situation where they will lay their egg masses usually within a mossy hummock. So they really like sphagnum mossy hummocks, especially those that are having a steep face and a lot of standing water below them. And these females will lay their egg masses in that mossy hummock, and they'll stay and actually guard that hummock for several weeks, if not over a month, until those eggs hatch. And when I say guarding those eggs, what they're really doing is they're secreting a bacteria from their skin that has antifungal components to it. And they try to spread that to the eggs to try to inhibit any sort of fungal growth on the egg. So overall, it increases those eggs' survival of actually hatching. And they really look for that steep face with the standing water below it, because once those eggs hatch, the larvae will drop straight into the water, and they'll continue to develop for another month or so as larvae within the vernal pool, where they then metamorphose, they lose their external gills, and then move into the upland forest adjacent to the vernal pool as juvenile salamanders. And, I've talked about kind of these species that are using it for reproduction, for development, for their entire life cycle. There's a lot of other animals that will use these habitats opportunistically. This includes a lot of different bird species. So we know species like red-shouldered hawks will often forage within these habitats, often preying on a lot of amphibians and reptiles that might be present. Here we have a barred owl that is foraging within one of these habitats, unfortunately, probably eating one of our salamanders or frogs. So this is a common sight that we've seen in a lot of our trail cameras. We often see a lot of wood duck activity in the spring in these habitats. You even see river otters occasionally using these habitats. I have a vernal pool on our property that right adjacent to it is a river otter den, and I've seen them in our vernal pool here. We'll see wolf packs as well as lone wolves kind of passing through this habitat. Whether or not they're truly using it just demonstrates that this is something that they're at least traveling through. And one thing that, you kind of saw in that earlier video, but I was, putting up these trail cameras, I was pretty surprised by how much bear activity we actually see within these vernal pools. And if you look behind this bear in the front here, that vegetation kind of to the left of it, you can see the tops have been chewed off. I believe that is wild kala. And so they're foraging within these habitats. They're not just passing through. And so here we have a sow with a cub in the spring, just kind of playing around in the vernal pool. Females probably foraging. They also get extremely curious while they're hanging out in these vernal pools and like to mess with their trail cameras. And they also like to vandalize a lot of our equipment as well. But really, it's a lot of different species that use this for either key aspects of their life cycle, or they opportunistically use it for foraging, for thermoregulation, or for breeding opportunities. And so kind of that next point, or I've kind of gotten ahead of myself here, but kind of distinguishing between obligate species and opportunistic or more facultative species. And I've already kind of mentioned them as well, but what I consider to be really, in addition to the fairy shrimp, kind of the poster child or the quintessential species that really, if you find it, you often know that you're within a vernal pool, is the spotted salamander. Um, so these are fossorial salamanders, meaning that for the majority of their active season, they are underground. They're in mammal burrows, they're dug down deep under decaying woody debris, and they're often not something that is readily found as you're out in the woods. But they're fairly common where they are found. But in Minnesota, they're really only found within about 2 counties. So in the greater scheme, they're pretty rare within Minnesota, but in areas they might be locally abundant because of the presence of vernal pools. And so in the spring, as the snow starts to melt, as these vernal pools start to ice out and soil temperatures increase, and you get your first really, really big rainfall in the spring. So usually sometime in April, these salamanders will come out in huge numbers, usually at night, to congregate in these vernal pools to breed. So generally, it's the males that arrive first. They deposit what's called a spermatophore, usually on top of leaves or on top of a stick, and the females come by and they'll pick up those spermatophores to then fertilize their eggs. And what's really cool is at nights when we've gone out to try to get an idea of the phenological timing of when this is occurring, we've kind of hit the mark and found nights where we've had over 120, 150 salamanders in a single vernal pool. And sometimes those are just the males that have arrived at that point. So here's an example of what their egg masses look like. It's kind of hard to tell the scale here in this image, but they're sometimes the size of like a grapefruit or a softball. And what's really cool is the females will deposit these on sticks, branches, leaves. And what you can't really see in this image is all around these little embryo is a larger kind of clear gelatinous mass. If you were to pick this up out of the water, it maintains its structure. And this is just kind of a protective coating around those eggs. And they'll kind of linger in these vernal pools as they develop. Here's kind of more of a close-up of that embryo starting to develop, starting to take the shape of a salamander. So at the top, you can kind of see its head. Those frilly parts, those are external gills, and this one has yet to develop any limbs. But this development takes place over a couple weeks or a month or so. This is often driven by water temperatures. The warmer the water, the faster the development. And by about mid to late June or so, the larvae have hatched out of the eggs. And here we have of larvae. This is about mid to early July. This is about the size of some of those spotted salamander larvae. You'll get blue spotted salamander larvae also mixed in, and those are sometimes hard to distinguish when they're this size. But just here's an example. And for another month or so, that larval development occurs. And then similar to the four-toed salamanders that I mentioned earlier, they'll lose those external gills and then move into the adjacent uplands as juvenile salamanders. And just another kind of key component of why they're important, particularly here in Minnesota, is this is a relatively understudied habitat within Minnesota. There's other states farther to the east, like Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Maine, that have much more robust monitoring efforts of vernal pools. Michigan's a prime example of leveraging a lot of community science efforts to monitor vernal pools. They have something called the Pool Patrol. So it's a large community science effort. And this is something that I'd love to try to move towards here in Minnesota in the coming years, just because I personally have a lot of interest in these habitats, and there's a lot of rare species that use them. So I think leveraging a lot of community interest in these habitats will help us protect them even better. And so getting to that next point of, how do we protect these habitats? What are some strategies that we can employ, particularly when we're conducting any sort of forest management? And I'm going to kind of start at what I would consider to be more kind of bare minimum, while still really valid and useful approaches, and then kind of start moving up in tiers of kind of what is the gold standard, what could be the best thing that you could do while still conducting forest management. So many of you are familiar with the Minnesota Forest Resource Council. They have voluntary site level forest management guidelines. And these kind of lay out some strategies on how to protect vernal pools. And I should clarify that within their guidelines, they refer to them as seasonal ponds. So just know that if you're looking through these guidelines, you're not necessarily going to see the term vernal pools. And one strategy that they identify is to make sure that you get to know your site and to spend time to identify and try to delineate these vernal pools, ideally in the spring if possible, or really just during the growing season to some degree, So you can really try to get a better idea of that high water mark during that growing season to get really a good delineation. Another thing that they recommend is establishing what's called a filter strip. And at a bare minimum, they suggest a 50-foot filter strip. This filter strip, that distance threshold can increase as you have more slope or more topography adjacent to it. So the steeper the slope, the more filter strip that you should employ. And the purpose of these filter strips are really to avoid any heavy equipment use within that distance threshold from the wetland edge. Yet within that filter strip, they still allow significant tree removal. They do recommend kind of at least a ring of trees around the perimeter of these wetlands, yet still within that 50-foot filter strip, you can reach in and still harvest trees. This is meant to minimize any rutting, any soil compaction or soil disturbance within that filter strip. I believe they say that, try to minimize soil disturbance to about 5% within that filter strip, if any soil disturbance. And the purpose is to try to reduce that sedimentation or any sort of runoff that might go into that wetland, just by having that vegetative barrier between them. They also recommend keeping any slash or, of course, woody debris out of it. I do recommend that as well. As you saw in some images, there is woody debris in vernal pools. They can, in some cases, create habitat, but I think it's best to kind of let nature take its course. And if trees are going to drop in, let them drop in naturally, and to not necessarily overload that area with woody debris. And the MFRC recommends avoiding any sort of pesticide use within or in proximity to vernal pools, and I do strongly recommend that. As I noted, there's extremely diverse aquatic invertebrates within these habitats. And so using any sort of pesticide use close by is not recommended. There are kind of aquatic safe pesticides, but still I think it's best to err on the side of caution because you don't always know how it might impact some of those invertebrates within the habitat. So let's take it a bit of a step further here. So those MFRC guidelines, it's a great step in the right direction, but I think there can be more done to these habitats to better protect the integrity, as well as kind of preserving that surrounding forest around them to benefit a lot of the wildlife species that use these habitats. So while this might seem like a large jump, I do strongly recommend a no harvest buffer around the perimeter of these wetlands. In a perfect world, I would say about 100 to 200 foot buffer around these vernal pools. And I should just take a step back too. And these numbers kind of come from a variety of different sources. We have salamander guidelines here at the DNR. We have a lot of different literature that kind of points to like how far particular species might travel from a vernal pool and the type of habitat they need, as well as just kind of expert opinion and just what I've seen on the ground anecdotally. So I would say 100 to 200 foot no harvest buffer if possible. But at a minimum, I would recommend at least a 50-foot no harvest buffer around these vernal pools. There's been studies, particularly done here in Minnesota, with some Forest Service researchers that demonstrated that by doing at least a 50-foot no harvest buffer, you minimize those changes to the hydrology of the wetland. So meaning that there's very little change to either water depths or little change to the hydro period, meaning how long that wetland holds standing water. Yet a 50-foot no harvest buffer still has shown to have dramatic impacts to the aquatic invertebrates and other animals using this habitat. And I would say as you get outside of that no harvest buffer, I'd aim to retain something about 80% residual basal area within another 100 to 200 feet from that buffer edge. So in extreme cases, up to about 400 feet from that edge of the wetland, should you be kind of altering your harvest. Ways in which you might complete this is through a method like variable density thinning. So as you're closer to that no harvest buffer, maybe you retain more trees, and as you get farther and farther away, you harvest a higher density of trees. And so again, it's just kind of this gradual change in the density of thinning. You could also employ something like a gap harvest, where in many cases you have up to a 400-foot no harvest buffer, as areas, in addition to areas that are kind of carved out as little gap harvests around the edge. And while this might seem extreme and in many cases not even logistically possible, there is literature that kind of points to a minimal to a no harvest buffer of about 600 feet will protect a lot of the more mobile terrestrial animals that use these habitats. So in this case, this is from literature for spotted salamanders, that while they do use those vernal pools and those are extremely important for their reproduction, they do migrate out of those vernal pools for the rest of the growing season, and in many cases can travel very far away to then establish a home range. So if you truly want to try to protect, in this paper they talk about protecting about 95% of the spotted salamander population that might be dependent on a particular vernal pool, that you want to be trying to protect about up to 600 feet away from that vernal pool edge. And let's zoom out a little bit too, and not just focus on a single vernal pool. And you got to think about kind of that landscape scale and think about the connectivity between adjacent wetlands. And so there's some literature, some policy within the DNR that talks about vernal pools within about 300 feet. That's considered those in close proximity. If you have the flexibility, I think distances greater than that is important too to maintain connectivity. But really just thinking about things at a landscape scale and how might animals move in between these habitats. And while this might be easier said than done, try to think about ways to identify low points between vernal pools where there may be water that overflows, and look for areas with high canopy cover, high forest floor cover to be suitable traffic corridor. Excuse me. Sorry, everyone. Got a frog in my throat. And in between these travel corridors, ideally these would be no-cut corridors. Or really, you just want to try to limit any sort of bisecting of these corridors that might inhibit travel. And a really good way to at least do some initial, desktop recon, again, is looking at that national wetland inventory to see if it looks like there's any wetland features within your habitat. I also really, really strongly recommend that if you're going to be working in proximity to vernal pools with forest management, that you try to conduct those operations during frozen soil conditions only. If you need to kind of work a little bit within the shoulder seasons, particularly in the fall, just try to limit any sort of operations that occur between March 15th and September 30th. As I mentioned, some of these shoulder seasons, you might not be operating already as it is because things are starting to get soft. But in particular, in the spring, again, some of those salamander species, they are a little more cold tolerant. And so they may be out in what is still considered frozen soil conditions, maybe in late March. So I think it's best to try to end any sort of operations by about March 15th to avoid any of that potential activity going on by some of these rare species. And really the purpose of conducting these in frozen soil conditions is to really try to minimize those impacts to the ground layer and try to reduce any direct mortality to any plants or animal life. And as kind of mentioned in those MFRC guidelines, I again really strongly recommend trying to avoid any sort of chemical site prep in proximity to these wetlands, particularly any sort of herbicide or pesticide. So to kind of give a really quick high-level summary of some of these strategies, first, get boots on the ground to identify where these occur and try to get really good delineations of these, again, typically in the spring when they're at their high water mark. And then to the best of your ability, depending on kind of what flexibility you have in land management, try to buffer these as much as you can to protect the integrity, not only of the wetland and its hydrology, but of all the animals that depend on the upland forest surrounding these habitats. And as you look at kind of the larger landscape, really try to prioritize canopy cover. I didn't mention this earlier, but I said retaining about 80% basal area, residual basal area. You can also equate this to something like trying to retain at least 70% canopy cover in the surrounding area, and really think about that connectivity between these adjacent wetlands. And again, really try to operate under frozen soil conditions to minimize impacts not only to the habitat itself, but the species that might be in the forest floor during those active seasons. So just going to give a really quick high-level summary of some of the work that the Minnesota DNR is currently doing in relation to vernal pools and what we're trying to learn. So as I mentioned, that we're doing some work with four-toed salamanders, and we're very particularly interested in how are four-toed salamander populations changing over time in response to our forest management. And why are we picking this particular species? Well, they're relatively recently found here in Minnesota. So they were first detected in Itasca County in 1994. And in Minnesota, as well as the rest of their range in North America, there's very little known about habitat use beyond their breeding ecology. We do know that they have very limited dispersal abilities, and we do know that they occur in very small, isolated populations. And because of those features, they were identified as a species of special concern in Minnesota in 1996. So that is still a state listing, but it doesn't have the same legal protections as, let's say, a threatened or endangered species. And because of those limited dispersal abilities, meaning that if their habitat is disturbed and no longer suitable, they don't really have an easy ability to just pick up and leave and move to a new site. So because of that, and because that they already occur in these small isolated locations, we do have a lot of habitat management concerns for these populations. And so we're employing what's called a before-after control impact study design. And that's a fancy way of just saying we have about 45 wetlands that we're monitoring. Half of those are going to experience some sort of forest management activity over an 8-year window. The other half are not going to experience forest management activity. And we're surveying these wetlands for four-toed salamander presence in their egg masses. And we can get data on pre-harvest and post-harvest, as well as concurrently collecting data on these undisturbed sites, just to try to get an idea of, does their abundance change? And we do hypothesize that their abundance is going to decrease post-forest management, because it often does create a lot of unsuitable habitat conditions for amphibians by increasing soil temperature and decreasing soil moisture. It's just not really suitable for a species that is so dependent on moist, damp environments. In addition to salamanders, we're doing a lot of work about studying the vegetation within these vernal pools. So you might be familiar with the DNR's native plant community classifications. So you might have a sugar maple basswood forest that you're working with. But as you kind of key things out with native plant communities, looking at the kind of shrub layer and the forbs and ferns and different plants and soils, we actually might key out this kind of diverse habitat into a specific class, like an MHN 35. We don't have native plant community classifications for vernal pools, despite them already themselves being a really diverse habitat type. And so there's efforts going on to try to create kind of a similar native plant community classification or classifications for vernal pools. And so this entails a lot of in-depth vegetation monitoring in a lot of different vernal pools. And thankfully, we're using our four-toed salamander monitoring wetlands as kind of the pilot wetlands to develop this methodology. And as a byproduct of that, we get a really detailed explanation of what vegetation characteristics and what species and diversity are present within vernal pools. So it gives me the opportunity to then go back after forest management has occurred, to say not only how has the salamander populations changed, but also how has the plant community changed. And one of the last things I'll talk about is we're employing methods to try to survey for spotted salamanders using eDNA. So this is environmental DNA. And essentially, what this is doing is we're collecting water samples, pumping those water samples through a filter, and then seeing does spotted salamander DNA show up in those filters. We are concurrently doing egg mass and larval surveys at the same time as eDNA collection. So it's kind of a sanity test of we know that spotted salamanders are present because we saw their egg masses or we saw their larvae. Do we also detect them using eDNA? This is the collaboration with St. Cloud State University. And we're primarily focusing on areas where we already know spotted salamanders exist to try to determine, is this an effective method? And if proven effective, we want to really expand this out to other portions within the state to try to better understand spotted salamander range. Because as I said, currently they are only found in 2 counties very close to the Wisconsin border. And we really don't know if they exist elsewhere in the state. And I just want to acknowledge, all this work going on at the DNR and just my knowledge about vernal pools is not something that I just obtained all by myself. That it's been a huge effort. A lot of people have supported this work. A lot of people have started this work, and I'm just kind of piggybacking off the shoulders of giants. So just want to acknowledge a lot of different people that have helped with the field work, a lot of the behind the scenes logistics of survey design and just statistical support in general, as well as a lot of our funding supports through LCCMR and the Non-Game Wildlife Program. And with that, I just want to thank you all for your time to attend this. Looks like there's been some chatter within the chat, so if there's any questions, I'd be happy to try to answer those. So thank you so much. I guess I can, Peter, I don't know if you want to field some of the questions or if I should.
I froze, so
Oh,
don't mind me.
right.
Thank you, Spencer. That was excellent. I really appreciate your presentation and toughing it out, given the fact that you're not feeling
Yeah,
100%.
sorry about that, folks.
And we do have a great deal of, of questions in the chat, and I will try to get to those. I'll also post in, as Spencer's answering, the links for future webinar series calendar and SFEC events, as well as how to access those continuing ed credits. But I want to jump right into the questions. And so let's start first. There's a couple questions that all kind of asked about the nature of vernal pools, of whether they're ever spring fed or there are distinctions between vernal pools, wetlands, wet areas. Can you talk about some of those distinctions and how we characterize vernal pools and their associated moisture regime?
Yeah, so that point on spring fed again, that is, I would say typically the source of water for vernal pools, it's going to be snow melt in the spring and rain. These are generally not spring fed. They're generally not just, like the water table isn't just close enough that it's just filling these in the spring just because of that. It is truly kind of it's our weather, it's our climate that is filling these. And something I didn't really touch on is the potential impacts of climate change to these habitat features. That's something that we are concerned about, particularly these drying up faster or these just disappearing because of that. So really, when it comes to that hydrologic input to these vernal pools, it is snow and it is rain are those primary sources. And again, there should be, in general, no permanent water source contributing to that. So if there's an adjacent open water, emergent water, wetland or emergent vegetation wetland, that should not be contributing to it. That would not be considered a vernal pool, because in some cases, like central mud minnows or fish could then potentially, invade that habitat. So again, it is water that is generally isolated. So hopefully that mostly answers that question.
Yes, thank you for that. And so additionally, there were some questions about woody debris in the vernal pools. Seems like the conditions would be good for preservation. And makes me think of the Spruce Project, where they found several thousand-year-old spruce logs in the peat. Can you talk a little bit about the deposition of some of that slash into vernal pools and how maybe cutting into that buffer zone or preservation of some of those trees around it might preserve the input of those, but also contrastingly how the difference between that and then avoiding putting slash into those vernal pools.
Yeah, yeah. So that is it is admittedly a bit of a gray area in my mind, where it's like you do see, down woody debris in a vernal pool in some cases as being beneficial. And so those filter strips that allow for removal of trees but still leave some trees lingering, those are more exposed to kind of wind throw. They may fall in. And so, yes, in theory, that those could create some habitat over time. But I hesitate to say go ahead and start to drop slash within these vernal pools because we don't have a great understanding of what is too much, what is too little, how is it truly going to impact that wetland over time. We do see trees that have been down in a vernal pool for years and years and years. They develop moss, and then we have salamanders nesting within that moss. So it's like, in some cases, it is extremely important habitat. But I know this is a wishy-washy answer because it's something that I kind of struggle with too. Of like, yes, down woody debris is important, but I really, really hesitate to artificially do that ourselves without a better understanding of kind of knowing a threshold of how much is enough or how much is too much. And really, by retaining more of a no harvest buffer around it, it's not just about trying to keep slash out. It's a lot about maintaining that canopy cover and maintaining that hydrology of the wetland. Because in a lot of cases, the animals that depend on these really do not do well when water temperatures rapidly increase. A lot of our invertebrates are not going to do well if those water temperatures drastically increase. I made the point of, some amphibian development might be a little bit faster in warmer water, but that also might mean that those wetlands dry up so much faster that the larvae is not even able to fully develop. So they might hatch early, but there's short enough hydro period because that canopy cover is opened up enough because the surrounding forest has been harvested that it's just no longer suitable for them in the long term. So that's a bit of a non-answer, and I apologize for that. But for the most part, it is a gray area. But I do not recommend dropping slash into vernal pools without a better understanding.
I appreciate that. Um, and so to continue, and thank you again for everyone who provided questions. What are your thoughts on protecting vernal pools from encroaching invasive species? We received a number of questions concerning the impact of buckthorn and how to protect against it, or the effects on those vernal pools if and when invasion occurs. And then following that, maybe your thoughts on, the effect of EAB on on ash trees, which may occasionally surround those pools.
Yeah, those are great questions. So as far as invasive species, I personally haven't dealt too much with buckthorn. I think the biggest immediate impact is obviously impacting the vegetative community. As I mentioned, there are some state threatened plant species that are associated with these habitats. So the introduction of something like buckthorn might outcompete them or just shade them out to a point where they're no longer competitive. I think one of the more detrimental invasive species to vernal pools would be invasive earthworms. These are definitely known to significantly impact some of those sensitive fern species. So I should have mentioned it in kind of those management strategies, but just making sure that equipment is disinfected for earthworm eggs or anything like that prior to conducting management is extremely important because these are sensitive habitats, and introducing something like earthworms can drastically impact the vegetative layer, which is then going to have compounding impacts for the wildlife as well. As far as EAB, that is something that we've been talking about a lot of what is that going to do to these vernal pools, because we do see a lot of ash within the interior and surrounding areas of these vernal pools. But we just wonder, are these gonna then flood and just kind of be these like sedge kind of grassy areas that have a little bit of standing water, but all the tree canopy cover is kind of dead around it, so it's maybe more open canopy. And we honestly don't really know at this point of like what we can do about that, other than right now trying to get a baseline of what our vegetative composition looks like now before EAB hits these sites. And so in addition to looking at pre and post forest management, we could potentially look at pre and post EAB within these sites. There was studies, I believe, out of UMN Duluth, out of NRI, Natural Research Institute, looking at kind of mimicking the impacts of EAB within vernal pools. And what they saw, at least for animal assemblages, is there's this shift from kind of vernal pool obligate species to more like open wetland associated species. So a change in the amphibians, maybe you're getting more green frogs or mink frogs and not as many wood frogs, as well as kind of more open wetland habitat bird species are found in these habitats as well after they kind of mimicked this EAB invasion. So there is some work being done, but within the DNR and the impacts to vernal pools, right now it is monitoring efforts, and I don't necessarily have a silver bullet for what we could do to try to offset any impacts at this point. But great question.
Awesome. Thank you. Um, Another question. So can you speak a little bit to the importance of vernal pools for water quality, forest health, and resilience?
Yeah, I mean, admittedly, I'm not a water chemist or anything like that, but I do know that a lot of the species that are present in vernal pools are often very indicative of the water quality. They're not going to exist if that water quality drastically decreases. So you can kind of view these as a bit of a canary in a coal mine situation, that if all of a sudden you start to see changes in water quality, you start to see changes in the species, you know that there could be changes in the forest and the surrounding area as well. So you're kind of using this as a bit of an index of forest health, of do vernal pools exist? What kind of diversity do you see within these vernal pools? And if you see that diversity changing over time, potentially using that as like an index of general forest change in that surrounding area.
Great. Thank you. And the last question I believe that I see is about, seasonality of cutting and the need for filter strips versus, and you went into greater depth after the question came in. But if during frozen ground conditions, do we need that filter strip? Um, what size of the pool would a filter strip be needed if logging occurred during a drier summer? If a 50-foot buffer is placed around every vernal pool, some sales won't be economically viable, which I believe you understand. But I also have my own sort of follow-up question that connects with this a little bit about, speaking to the changes in the importance of some shading for those and that, solar radiation cover and protection of them so that that moisture gradient doesn't change too much. Could you speak to that a little bit and the seasonality of cutting and protection?
Yeah. Yeah. So, that point of, if you're going to harvest already under frozen soil conditions, do you need a filter strip? Does it really matter as much? I think it really all comes down to what are you trying to protect and what are you trying to do? And I do absolutely recognize that not every vernal pool can have a 100 to 200-foot buffer, let alone even a 50-foot buffer. So I would say that for my purposes and for what I'm interested in trying to protect, that even if it is done during frozen soil conditions, it is still important for the longevity of those animals and plants that depend on that habitat. And that 50-foot no harvest buffer, I think, takes it a step further outside of that filter strip to try to protect that surrounding habitat. And Peter, to your point on kind of moisture regimes and everything, you conduct a harvest in the winter, yet you don't observe or employ a filter strip, that's going to drastically change that moisture gradient of that wetland. It's going to drastically change the plants and animals that can survive there. So even if that immediate impact is you're trying to minimize it by doing it in the winter, it is still going to have a long-term impact to that vernal pool as a whole over time. And it's going to just take so much longer for it to try to return to its pre-management state. And in some cases may not actually even return to that pre-management state, that it's just been altered too drastically with that management. So I would still say that at an absolute minimum, those filter strips are needed. Take it a step further and do 50-foot buffers around the ones that potentially are, let's say, if you have areas of higher concentrations where you can maintain connectivity, maybe those are the ones that you prioritize that 50-foot no harvest buffer to try to, save that complex. If there's ones that is more isolated, that whether or not you do a 50-foot no harvest buffer or a 50-foot filter strip, that arguably that wetland is likely going to be changed and there's just not going to be as much input of other species to it. Maybe those are ones where you just do a filter strip and not a buffer. So again, it is about balancing competing priorities. I recognize as land managers, it's not all about preserving wildlife habitat. It's not all about, the reptiles and amphibians that I speak of. But at the same time, you want to still value those and try to balance that in your landscape decision-making process.
Okay, sounds good. Thank you for that. And that brings us to 10 o'clock here. So for those who do have additional questions, and if I wasn't able to get to them all, Spencer, do you mind if people reach out to you via your email that you
Sure.
provided
There's,
here?
yeah, hopefully my screen's still showing there, but there's my email and my phone number if you need to get a hold of me.
Great.
So yeah, if there's any lingering questions, I'm happy to chat about it.
Well, thank you again, Spencer. It was an excellent presentation. And thank you to everyone who joined us today. I hope to see you all again on March 10th for our next webinar, which will be a 2026 Minnesota Forest Health Update presented by August Kramer with the Minnesota DNR Division of Forestry. Until then, take care and stay warm.